Hello everyone, this is Mr.Brass, and today I'm going to be doing a deistic substitution video where I, as a deist, substitute for an atheist or Abrahamist depending on the topic. Today I'm going to help out atheists by answering some of those questions by one Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio. Just so people know, I have nothing against Braxton personally. I've even tried to get him on the podcast before. I don't want this to be taken as an attack on Braxton. Take this as a friendly response.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning. So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
For one, I don't think this is a very good argument to start out with. For one, if I were an atheist who just happened to find this video, I'd have no idea what your position on many topics that you laid out were. And even now as a deist, I don't know all the facts you know about that I also agree with you on, or you with me. This runs the risk of me laying out information you don't know about, assume you do know about it, and further assuming that you agree with said information. Christians pretty much don't agree with each other on anything outside of perhaps Jesus being God and Him raising from the dead. In terms of morality, I subscribe to what you call moral, virtuous error theory, which combines the meta-ethical theory of error theory with the normative ethical theory of virtue ethics. This means I believe all moral claims are ultimately false, but that the cultivation of virtues have instrumental value for our daily life. Like linguistic virtuous error, while our moral claims may not be technically correct, our reasoning to certain conclusions have instrumental value. My ethics are pretty naturalistic and based solely on human nature and how societies interact. I consider myself a determinist who ultimately doesn't mind the idea of compatibilism. Compatibilism appears to be where scholarship is heading on the issue based on surveys, and from what I've read, I generally find it okay, although I think free will is highly overrated. I've done many videos on error theory and free will on this channel, and I recommend people watch them. Also, I don't know how Christianity accounts for evil and suffering when the Bible doesn't care to give an account of the origin of evil. Old Testament scholar Dr. Walter Brueggemann says as much. In fact, he says this about evil.
Is that the Old Testament posits a kind of a dualism. It does not speculate on how that dualism came about. It doesn't go into whether it's a fallen angel or something like that. But the gain of talking about dualism is that evil then is not only a negation of good, but it is an aggressive force that wants to negate the good.
I'd also like to note that just because we both can give explanations for the things you mentioned, that doesn't mean we are on even footing. That isn't how abduction works. I believe Christianity expanded for the same reason many cults do: good marketing and a good helping of the backfire effect. Seeing how Jesus, the apocalyptic prophet, was crucified, his followers had only two options: ditch him or let their cognitive dissonance run wild to explain the fact he got crucified in the most positive way possible. A man quite familiar with the history of Christianity gives the following reply.
But if we look at the scholars, and there are plenty who are not Christians, for example, a lot of Jewish scholars are very interested in that period and therefore in people like Jesus. If we look at what they think about the historical Jesus, what they accept is that he was most likely what we call an apocalyptic prophet. So in around about that period, the Jews had for centuries been of the opinion that they were the chosen people of God, and that Israel, or that general territory, was the promised land that had been given to them. Now, that was all kind of like myth and folklore, but by the beginning of the 1st century AD, that was still very much what they believed. Now, the problem was they had been conquered by the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Macedonians, then dominated by the Ptolemies, and then by the Seleucids, and then had a brief period of independence. And then that fell apart and they got conquered by the Romans. So the whole idea that they were the chosen people living in the promised land wasn't really squaring with reality. So they had to try and figure out, well, why is this happening? And for a long time, the answer was, well, the prophets would come along and say it's because you turned away from Yahweh, and if you turn back, then all these horrible punishments will go away. That was starting to wear a little bit thin. So an idea arose that eventually, very soon, God was going to fix this whole problem. God was going to intervene in history and usher in a kingship ruled by him with his Messiah, his anointed one, a descendant of King David, at his right hand as kind of his earthly viceroy. And this was all going to happen very soon. The Romans were going to get swept away by armies of angels. The world was going to be renewed. The dead were going to rise, because it wasn't fair that a whole lot of people who were righteous had died before this happened. So they were all going to be raised. Everyone was going to get raised from the dead. Everyone was going to get judged. All the bad people, including all the Romans, were going to get consigned to hell to be burned. And then everyone would live happily ever after. Now, if you were a peasant living in 1st century Judea or Galilee, and you were paying 1/3 of your income in tax, and you weren't getting anything for that, your family was poor, your children were starving, and anyone who thought about rebelling against this whole idea got killed or crucified. This idea that God was going to come and save you, and a Messiah would arise, and armies of angels would sweep away the bad people, and you and all your righteous friends were going to get saved and live in a magic, happy, renewed earth. That'd be pretty bloody appealing.
From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes perfect sense why we would long for meaning and purpose, even if it wasn't there. If humans were all depressed and lazy, we really wouldn't get anything done, and it would be easier for us to be killed, and thus we would die out as a species. Just so I don't ramble on more, I'm going to save my arguments that differentiate deism and Christianity till later on.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God, and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God?
Now, I personally find lacktheists that do that to be dumb and have a phobia to the burden of proof. David Bentley Hart does go over it beautifully in his Experience of God book. He says, beliefs regarding fairies are beliefs about a certain kind of object that may or may not exist within the world, and such beliefs have much the same sort of intentional shape and rational content as beliefs regarding one's neighbors over the hill, or whether there are such things as black swans. Belief regarding God concern the source and ground and end of all reality, the unity and existence of every particular thing and of the totality of all things, the ground of the possibility of anything at all. Confusing God and lowercase gods and expecting equal evidence or function of both is like confusing a toaster and bread and expecting equal evidence or function of both.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
Now, not all atheists are like this. I have pro-life atheist friends who despise prostitution in the sex culture we are in right now. I discussed this a bit with the atheist men's rights activist Paul Elam on my friend and I's show. Anyway, many atheists in America used to be Christians, and very often I find ex-fundamentalist. Conservative or Republican Christianity to some people appears to be the default type of Christian in our culture, and many atheists grew up as conservative Christians. It doesn't seem far-fetched to believe that when many atheists left the religion of their parents, they figured, well, if my parents were wrong on the big metaphysical facts of life, what is the odds they'd be right with about some smaller things like politics?
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief, as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
This is pretty much a copy of your second question. I agree. This comes in my opinion from a lack of philosophical knowledge and confusion over how the term belief is used in a confusion. The agnostic Steve McRae goes over this in his article 5 True Statements That I Hear Almost Every Day.
Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those?
You haven't shown those options to be impossible. Atheist philosophers like Graham Opie, Quentin Smith, and the like have made a good case for some of those things. It doesn't seem like a slam dunk on your part. Merely saying something is absurd doesn't make it such. Christian theism has a tendency to overcomplicate things, in my opinion, when it comes to looking for explanations. Deism and atheism are much more simpler in many ways. I'll give some of my reasons that I promised in the first one. Now, I would assume we both believe in virtues and at least agree it has great instrumental value to us. I believe a perfectly virtuous God doesn't exist because there are certain virtues a God can't have, as to have the virtues would require a defect on the God's part. Appealing to the Trinity won't work either, because to both have and not have a virtue is a contradiction. Courage is one such virtue. Courage, as defined by Aristotle, is more or less to act justly in the face of danger. This is what I call a defective virtue, i.e., a virtue that comes from a defect on the part of the agent. To act justly in the face of danger necessitates you being an agent that is capable of being in danger. God isn't capable of being in danger, and even Jesus wasn't truly in danger, as he knew ultimately he was going to be rose, at least according to the stories. Now, this is not a problem for a non-personal God, which deism grants. Also, the existence of what neuropsychologist Dr. Nicholas Humphrey calls egoistic suicide, or better put, suicide done by an agent because the agent feels it will end their conscious presence. This sort of phenomenon does raise problems for a personal God. Now, this isn't an argument from evil. Yahweh could have a just reason for allowing a person to take their life this way, but that wouldn't change how people have a seemingly innate sense that they can end their conscious presence. However, if we are made in the image of God and are supposed to have a sense of a personal God that we go to heaven with, that makes no sense. People should feel as though they can't end their conscious presence, that they will go to heaven. However, with a non-personal God, this makes sense. I have more to go on, but I'll give that snippet and leave it at that.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
This is a good question. I wouldn't say I have a favorite, as it seems pretty poor strategy to put everything into one camp. I find some B-theory Kalam arguments to be pretty good, like say the one from C.J. McCoff. I personally find the fine-tuning argument to be probably one of the best arguments, and I like the scientist Luke Barnes' take on it.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you?
I believe that God exists, but I'd personally be convinced of Christianity in specific if I'd seen the risen Jesus and got to feel his wounds. I find the Trinity to be absurd in many ways, but if someone could offer me a coherent argument for it, I'd be willing to consider Christianity. Overall, I think the question presupposes that we actually can control what we believe. I don't really think that is the case.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were.
In terms of moral and social, with me, not much. I was a liberal Christian and wasn't really taught the Bible and only went to church to see families from meetups. My sister I live with is bisexual and my family never was upset with her, and I know if I were gay, my family overall would have accepted me. I will say that the bigoted treatment of members of the LGBTQ community from guys like Steven Anderson really grinds my gears. The morality of a particular god or lowercase god seems important in whether you'd worship them. I would assume if it was shown Zeus existed, you would take one look at all of his affairs and adventures and say, nope, not worshiping him. Not saying Zeus is the same as Yahweh, but the morality you hear God or lowercase god doing does have an effect on whether or not you worship them. The moral epistemology argument for atheism by John Jung Park shows the fact that the commanding of objectively evil things is incompatible with an all-knowing, loving, and powerful God. So these moral issues can be used against Yahweh.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos?
Yes, actually, I read 3 commentaries by Dr. Craig Keener, Dr. Carolyn Lewis, and Dr. John Mcniel recently as part of my book in which I answer bad objections to the Bible.
If you found out today, to your satisfaction, that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your King?
Yes, many people tend to say they'd believe, but that they wouldn't worship because of the questionable ethics in the Bible. I don't find that compelling because I could still probably take a more liberal Christian stance like I did before, and that wouldn't make much of the moral objections I have go away. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.